Without warning, the world's second-largest economy dropped a bombshell that would reverberate across international markets for months to come. Beijing delivered a stunning decree that caught mining executives, government officials, and market analysts completely off guard. In a single stroke, Chinese authorities announced they would cease all iron ore purchases from BHP, a mining titan whose operations span continents and whose revenues rival the GDP of small nations. The directive left no room for interpretation. It was absolute. Ships already at sea, their hulls heavy with Australian ore, steaming toward Chinese harbors after weeks of ocean crossings, suddenly faced an uncertain fate. Would they be permitted to dock, or would they be forced to turn back, their cargo unwanted? But embedded within this commercial disruption was something more intriguing than a simple trade suspension. Beijing presented what might be interpreted as either a diplomatic gesture or a calculated challenge, depending on your perspective. The path to restoring business relations existed, but only on one condition. BHP would need to abandon the US dollar for transactions and embrace the Chinese renminbi instead. For a corporation that generated approximately $30 billion from Chinese sales in the previous year alone, the implications were profound. This wasn't merely China's largest iron ore supplier at risk. This was a relationship that had defined corporate strategy, supported thousands of jobs, and contributed substantially to Australia's economic prosperity. The situation poses questions with implications stretching far beyond corporate boardrooms in Australia. What does this confrontation reveal about the evolving dynamics of resource diplomacy? Can a nation built on commodity exports maintain its economic model when its largest customer begins imposing political conditions on purely commercial transactions? And perhaps most significantly, are we witnessing the early stages of a fundamental shift in how global trade will be conducted in the decades ahead? If you want to understand the forces reshaping the international economic order, the power struggles, currency battles, and resource politics that will define our era, you'll want to follow this story closely. Today, we're exploring a narrative about far more than iron ore and mining companies. This is about leverage, vulnerability, and the quiet transformation of economic power that's unfolding beneath the surface of daily headlines. To appreciate why this confrontation matters so deeply, we must first examine the geological and economic realities that positioned Australia as a mining superpower. When geologists assess the world's iron ore endowment, a small number of countries emerge as truly dominant players. Australia, Brazil, and China represent the big three. But among this elite group, Australia occupies a unique position. Beneath the Australian continent lie approximately 51 billion tons of economically extractable iron ore. That figure represents more than a quarter of all known deposits on Earth. To put this in perspective, this single nation possesses enough raw material to sustain global steel manufacturing for generations, even at current consumption rates. Yet Australia's advantages extend well beyond the sheer volume of ore in the ground. The quality of these deposits matters enormously in ways that fundamentally affect the economics of steel production. Australian iron ore ranks among the world's finest, with remarkably high concentrations of actual iron per ton of extracted rock. Higher grades mean steel manufacturers spend less on transportation for equivalent iron content, consume less energy during smelting, and generate higher yields from each ton processed. Geography compounds these advantages. Rather than scattered deposits requiring numerous small-scale operations, Australia's iron wealth concentrates in specific regions that permit massive, highly efficient extraction. The geological conditions are relatively favorable compared to deposits in other parts of the world, with ore bodies accessible through open-pit mining rather than expensive underground operations. The Pilbara region of Western Australia represents the crown jewel of this mining empire. This vast rust-colored landscape, one of the oldest geological formations on the planet, has become synonymous with industrial-scale resource extraction. Here, Multinational giants including Rio Tinto and BHP have constructed mining operations so large they're visible from orbital satellites. Mountains are systematically dismantled, billions of tons of earth are moved, and a constant stream of ore flows toward coastal export facilities. These aren't merely large mines in the traditional sense. They constitute integrated industrial complexes linking extraction sites to dedicated railway networks, some stretching hundreds of kilometers across desert terrain to specialized port facilities. The scale defies easy comprehension. Individual freight trains can exceed 2 kilometers in length, hauling tens of thousands of tons of ore in single journeys that repeat around the clock every day of the year. Within this global mining landscape, one customer dominates all others in terms of both volume and value. The customer that controls everything. China's appetite for iron ore is staggering, and honestly, it's unprecedented in the history of commodity markets. The statistical reality is stark. Roughly 83% of all iron ore exported from Australia ultimately arrives at Chinese ports. We're talking about trade flows valued at approximately $79 billion annually, a figure that represents about 2/3 of all commercial exchange between these two Pacific nations. This isn't simply an important trading relationship. For Australian mining companies, China represents virtually the entire ballgame. While other markets exist, they pale in comparison to the sheer scale of Chinese demand. This concentration creates a paradox. Massive sales volumes generate enormous revenue, but dependence on a single customer creates strategic fragility that can be exploited. An obvious question emerges when examining this dynamic. Why would China, a vast nation with substantial mineral resources of its own, choose to import iron ore at international prices rather than developing domestic production capacity? The answer lies in the harsh realities of geology and industrial economics. China does possess iron ore deposits within its borders, substantial ones in fact. But there's a critical difference between having ore in the ground and having ore that makes economic sense to extract. The majority of Chinese iron ore falls into what the industry categorizes as low-grade deposits. Current assessments place Chinese ore at approximately 33% iron content. That means for every ton of rock removed from a Chinese mine, only about 1/3 consists of usable iron. Compare this with premium Australian ore from the Pilbara, which typically exceeds 60% iron content, approaching double the concentration found in Chinese sources. This disparity isn't a minor inconvenience. It fundamentally transforms the economics of steel production. Lower-grade ore requires more energy to process, generates more waste, increases transportation costs, and ultimately delivers less value per dollar invested. China's deposits also tend to be geographically dispersed across numerous smaller operations rather than concentrated in massive, efficient extraction zones. This distribution pattern increases operational complexity, drives up cost per ton, and creates logistical challenges absent in Australia's centralized mining regions. When Chinese industrial planners conduct cost-benefit analyses, factoring in extraction expenses, ore quality, processing efficiency, and transportation, the conclusion consistently points in the same direction. Despite the costs of international shipping and import expenses, purchasing Australian ore proves more economically rational than expanding domestic production. It's a straightforward calculation that has shaped trade policy for more than 2 decades. But this apparently stable arrangement has experienced moments of severe turbulence, revealing the underlying tensions that would eventually erupt into open confrontation. When commercial relationships turn adversarial, BHP has long held a privileged position as one of China's most crucial iron ore suppliers. In 2024 alone, the Melbourne-based corporation shipped approximately $30 billion worth of ore to Chinese customers. On the surface, this appears to represent the ideal win-win scenario. Australia possesses a resource that China urgently needs. Both parties profit handsomely. Everyone benefits. However, This massive trade flow created an imbalance with far-reaching consequences. BHP's dominant market position granted the company extraordinary influence over Chinese markets. They weren't merely supplying a commodity. They effectively controlled critical market mechanisms, including the most sensitive element of any trade relationship: price. As Chinese demand continued its relentless upward trajectory, driven by massive infrastructure construction and rapid urbanization, BHP and fellow Australian suppliers recognized their advantageous position and exploited it aggressively. Prices climbed steadily higher, increasingly disconnected from actual production costs. Industry calculations reveal that extracting a ton of iron ore cost BHP approximately $20 when accounting for operational expenses. Yet prices charged to Chinese buyers often reached multiples of this baseline figure. Such profit margins naturally generated considerable resentment among Chinese industrial buyers, who increasingly viewed the arrangement as exploitative. But market dynamics alone don't fully explain this situation. The story has important geopolitical dimensions that help contextualize why Australian suppliers felt empowered to push prices to such extremes. We need to step back to 2018 to understand the broader context. That year witnessed the beginning of serious trade hostilities between the United States and China. As tariffs escalated and rhetoric intensified, nations worldwide confronted an uncomfortable decision about which great power they would support in this emerging confrontation. Australia's government under Prime Minister Scott Morrison made its choice abundantly clear. Canberra aligned firmly with Washington's increasingly confrontational approach toward Beijing, actively supporting efforts to constrain Chinese economic and strategic expansion. This political positioning had direct commercial ramifications. During this period, Australian suppliers deliberately escalated iron ore pricing to levels that many Chinese observers regarded as punitive. The benchmark price for iron ore with 62% iron content rocketed from $70 per ton to a stunning $220. This wasn't gradual market adjustment responding to supply and demand. This was a dramatic spike that tripled costs within a compressed time frame. The situation became even more provocative as Australian interests appeared to weaponize iron ore, treating it not merely as a commodity but as strategic leverage that could pressure China economically. The implicit message couldn't have been clearer. Chinese manufacturers could either accept premium pricing or face potential supply disruptions. Beijing's response was entirely predictable. No major economy, particularly one with China's strategic ambitions and acute sensitivity to national sovereignty, would tolerate such vulnerability indefinitely. Chinese policymakers recognized that overwhelming dependence on a single supplier, one closely aligned with their primary geopolitical rival, represented an unacceptable strategic weakness. What followed demonstrated impressive strategic execution. Between 2018 and 2022, China conducted a systematic diversification campaign. The statistics tell a remarkable story. Chinese reliance on Australian iron ore plummeted from 87% to just 40% during this period. This wasn't market drift. It was deliberate strategy executed with precision. Chinese buyers aggressively cultivated alternative suppliers in Brazil, Africa, and other regions previously considered secondary sources. Then came a political transformation in Australia that appeared to signal a new chapter. In 2022, Australian voters delivered a change in government, bringing the Labor Party to power under Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. The new administration quickly signaled a different approach, pursuing what they termed stabilization, a diplomatic recalibration designed to separate economic interests from security concerns. Both nations implemented measures aimed at easing commercial tensions and restoring trade normalcy. The approach seemed successful. By 2024, iron ore trade had largely recovered, with bilateral volumes approaching historic peaks recorded before the relationship deteriorated. International observers interpreted these developments as evidence of sustainable improvement, suggesting both sides had recognized mutual benefits and chosen pragmatism over confrontation. Then, everything changed. On the final day of September 2025, China issued a statement that, well, blindsided virtually every analyst, investor, and government official monitoring the relationship. Beijing announced the immediate cessation of all iron ore trade with BHP. The decision wasn't presented as temporary or negotiable. It was definitive. The truly unprecedented element was the condition attached to any potential trade resumption. Chinese authorities declared that henceforth, any iron ore exports from Australia to China must be settled in renminbi rather than US dollars. The policy encompassed everything, even shipments already in transit, loaded weeks earlier and currently crossing the Pacific, would fall under these new terms. On the surface, this appears to be a dispute about currency preference and payment mechanisms. Many Western analysts, at first, framed it precisely this way, as China's latest campaign to promote international usage of its currency, maybe even as an unreasonable demand given decades of dollar-denominated commodity trading. This interpretation, though, misses the profound strategic calculation at work. China isn't primarily concerned with which currency appears on invoices. The actual objective involves fundamentally restructuring the power dynamics that have characterized iron ore trade for decades. Consider China's position over the past 20 years. Despite being by far the world's largest iron ore purchaser, a position that should, in theory, confer significant bargaining power, Chinese buyers have consistently found themselves in weak negotiating positions regarding price. This paradox, honestly, has cost the Chinese economy enormously. Let's examine the current market to illustrate this dynamic. The spot price for iron ore on international exchanges hovers around $80 per ton, reflecting real-time supply and demand. Yet long-term contracts that China negotiated with suppliers like BHP frequently locked in prices exceeding $100 per ton. That $20 differential might seem modest in isolation, but multiply it by scale. China imports approximately 700 million tons of iron ore annually. That $20 markup, repeated across hundreds of millions of tons, translates to an additional cost burden exceeding $10 billion every single year. That's not a rounding error. It's a massive wealth transfer that Chinese policymakers have observed with mounting frustration. The root cause lies in the fundamental structure of international iron ore markets. Unlike markets with numerous competing suppliers creating genuine price discovery, iron ore trade has long been characterized by seller dominance. A small number of major producers, primarily Australian and Brazilian, have effectively controlled supply, while the US dollar's unchallenged position in global commodity pricing has reinforced this unequal dynamic. China's insistence on renminbi settlement represents an attempt to disrupt this system fundamentally. By changing the transaction currency, Beijing hopes to gain meaningful influence over pricing mechanisms that have long remained beyond its control. Building the infrastructure of economic independence. China's strategy extends far beyond this immediate confrontation. For years, Beijing has been methodically building the institutional infrastructure necessary to challenge Western commodity market dominance. The most significant initiative in this direction has been establishing the China Mineral Resources Group. This isn't simply another state-owned enterprise. It represents a fundamental restructuring of how China approaches international resource procurement. Previously, Chinese steel manufacturers operated largely independently when sourcing iron ore. Individual companies negotiated separate contracts, competed with each other for supplies, and presented to international markets as fragmented buyers. This fragmentation was precisely what allowed Australian and Brazilian suppliers to maintain pricing power despite facing enormous aggregate Chinese demand. The China Mineral Resources Group changes this equation entirely. By consolidating procurement needs of major domestic steel enterprises under one organizational umbrella, China has effectively unified what was once scattered buying power. Now, when this entity negotiates with BHP or Rio Tinto, it represents not one company, but essentially the entire Chinese steel industry. The strategic advantage is obvious. Instead of multiple Chinese buyers competing against each other and driving prices upward, suppliers now face a single massive counterparty with the ability to direct purchases toward cooperative suppliers and away from those deemed uncooperative. This is the kind of buyer power that can fundamentally alter market dynamics. But there's another dimension to China's currency demand that extends well beyond iron ore markets: the broader campaign to internationalize the renminbi and gradually erode US dollar global dominance. Currently, international commodity trade, particularly high-volume transactions involving resources like iron ore, remains one of the key pillars supporting the dollar's reserve currency status. Every day, billions of dollars in commodity trades occur in dollars, creating constant global demand for American currency and reinforcing its central role in the international financial system. China's push for renminbi settlement directly challenges this arrangement. By insisting that major commodity flows be priced and settled in Chinese currency, Beijing is essentially attempting to create an alternative pole in the global monetary system. The more trade that occurs in renminbi rather than dollars, the more global businesses need to hold Chinese currency, the more international financial institutions must develop renminbi capabilities, and the more the currency's international legitimacy grows. There's also a defensive strategic component at work. China has observed how the United States increasingly weaponizes the dollar-based financial system, imposing sanctions that can effectively exclude countries, companies, and individuals from international commerce. From Iran to Russia to Venezuela, Beijing has watched how dollar dominance provides Washington with coercive power, extending far beyond traditional military or diplomatic pressure. Renminbi settlement helps China reduce this systemic vulnerability. Transactions conducted in Chinese currency through Chinese financial institutions are inherently more difficult for Washington to monitor or disrupt. As China builds these alternative financial channels, it creates resilience against potential future sanctions or financial pressure campaigns. This brings us to the critical question that will determine outcomes. How severely will this dispute impact Australia, and will Australian companies prove willing to accept renminbi terms to maintain Chinese market access? To understand what's at stake for Australia, we need to examine how dependent major mining companies have become on Chinese demand. Recent analysis reveals that approximately 60% of BHP's total revenue originates from the Chinese market. This isn't diversification, it's concentration at an alarming degree. In 2024 alone, BHP exported 250 million tons of iron ore to China, generating cumulative revenue exceeding $30 billion. For a single market to represent such a massive proportion of a global corporation's business creates obvious vulnerability. The immediate market reaction to China's announcement demonstrated that investors grasped these stakes perfectly. When Beijing's suspension was announced, BHP's share price dropped between 3.4% and 4% in a single trading session. The company's market capitalization evaporated by nearly $39 billion in hours. That's wealth destruction on a scale that commands attention from every shareholder and board member. If China were to permanently sever iron ore trade with BHP, the financial consequences would prove catastrophic. Industry analysts estimate annual losses of at least $30 billion, roughly equivalent to eliminating the company's entire Chinese revenue stream. No corporation can simply absorb such a shock without fundamental restructuring, massive workforce reductions, and strategic reorientation. However, the implications extend far beyond a single company's balance sheet. The ripple effects would cascade through the Australian economy, touching millions of lives. Western Australia, where the vast majority of iron ore mining occurs, generates approximately 80% of the nation's total ore exports. The state government's fiscal health depends critically on these operations. Roughly 40% of state revenue derives from taxes and royalties generated by iron ore extraction and export. These aren't merely impressive numbers. They fund schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and essential services across the state. If the export channel to China were disrupted for an extended period, Western Australia's government would confront a budgetary catastrophe. Current projections suggest the state's budget deficit could balloon to 16.4 billion US dollars. That's not a deficit manageable through minor adjustments or efficiency gains. It would demand massive service cuts, federal bailouts, or both. The human cost might prove even more severe than fiscal impact. Australia's mining sector directly employs approximately 150,000 people. Generally well-paying positions that support families and entire communities built around mining operations. Beyond direct employment, the industry indirectly sustains more than 500,000 additional jobs in transportation, services, equipment manufacturing, and countless sectors connected to mining activity. We're witnessing more than a trade dispute. We're observing the early stages of a fundamental power shift in how the global economy operates. Who sets the terms, which currencies matter, and whether resource-rich nations can maintain independence when facing concentrated buyer power. The answer to China's ultimatum will reveal whether the era of dollar-dominated commodity trade is ending, or whether it still possesses the resilience to withstand direct challenges from the world's second-largest economy.